Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen. Give me just 1 second. We love the technology. All right. So can everyone see my screen? Give me a thumbs up if you can. Thank you so much. So welcome. We are today going to talk about creating a global narrative for queer and trans liberation. I'm Jamila Aisha Brown. I'm joined with an incredible panel. We have Tihi Hayslett, Ruth Muganzi, and Bryanna Jenkins joining us today. And there's been so much talk about what we need to do as a community to create a narrative to counter all of the hate that has been coming towards queer and trans non-binary communities. But today we actually want to focus on what does it mean to create a narrative that is radically inclusive and that is about liberation. So instead of constantly fighting against, for me, it's my personal belief, which is why the title is such, I believe that we need to create these worlds that we want to live in and see. And today we have a mix of folks who are having different experiences in that path. So we are going to talk about the threats that are coming to our community, what are the narratives that are surfacing as a part of that, and then also examine where are the opportunities, where are actually the places in the world where we are seeing some of the world that we want to create. So we're going to talk about that today. Uh-oh. There we go. Before we get started, just to kind of set the tone that we're in. So as we know, there's been rising anti-LGBTQIA plus rhetoric and violence and legislation that we've seen happening around the world. We recently just saw the passage of the harshest anti-queer and trans legislation passed in Uganda this year. Our panelist Ruth will be speaking to that. We see across the African continent that same-sex relationships are only legal in 22 out of 54 countries. In the United States, we've seen in red states across the US, anti-drag legislation, which is truly anti-trans legislation in disguise, popping up. We've heard so much about how trans youth in particular are being denied healthcare throughout the United States. And as we're looking at areas like Europe and Central Asia, we're actually seeing a rise in violence against queer and trans folks happening at the highest rates that we've seen recorded in a decade. And at the same time, we're also seeing movements in areas like Latin America, where same-sex marriage is being passed. So as we're seeing a lot of the negative, there are some moments and glimmers of hope. Now, before we get started, I want to give a shout out to Carly, who I work with, who's amazing, who helped us put this presentation together, who lives in Grenada. And while we were putting this presentation together and working as a panel, unfortunately, we lost one of our queer and trans siblings, Josiah Jonty Robinson, who was a model, actor, singer, songwriter in Grenada, who was well known, was just such a bright light. And unfortunately, after he presented at a Pride celebration in Grenada, the next day he was found dead. And they found him in the river, and really just wanted to not only just honor Jonty for who he was and what such a bright light and a joy that he brought to the community, but also take a moment to dedicate this to all of our queer, trans, and non-binary siblings who we've lost. Oftentimes we're so focused on the legislation, but we often forget that there are real people who are impacted by that. I think our community knows that very well, but it's just another very sad reminder, especially during times like Pride, where it's a month-long celebration of the community. So for these things to happen in a moment where it often can sometimes feel like the whole world is loving and supportive, just kind of brings home the reality that we're all facing. And if we can make this world a better place for Jonty, for Black trans women who are just targeted at unbelievable rates of violence, then we're doing what we need to do as a global community. So activists, as I said, are working globally on these topics. And today we are joined by folks that I am so excited for you to hear from. We're going to hear from Bryanna Jenkins from the United States. We're going to hear from Tihi Hayslett, who is based in Mexico right now at Netroots Nation in Chicago. And we're so happy to have Ruth Muganzi join us from Uganda. It is 8 o'clock at night in Uganda. So please show Ruth so much love for being here on a Friday night to be here and share with us all of this. So thank you all so much. We're going to get started with Bryanna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bryanna Jenkins. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the National Organizing Director for Lavender Rights Project. We are a Black trans-led and Black trans intentional organization based in Seattle, Washington. I came to the organization and began my position in April of this year because the org wanted to expand its reach nationally, and more specifically, LRP wanted to build intentional and sustainable relationships with Black trans-led, with other Black trans-led orgs across the country. So a little bit about what's going on here in the United States is pure chaos right now. Plus, more recently, the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, released a slew of bad rulings last week, affirmative action, which I'm sure everybody's heard of, but also 303 Creative LLC versus Elena's ruling, in which the Supreme Court invalidated a state anti-discrimination ordinance on the basis of queer identity, because it could possibly violate a person's First Amendment religious freedoms, which makes it scary because it basically gives folks license to discriminate against LGBTQ folks just purely on the basis of their religion, and they don't agree with LGBTQ folks. So we have yet to see like the truly devastating consequences of this decision, but it's another another thing that really speaks to how serious things are here in the States. Also, we are in the midst of a very coordinated trans disinformation that is coming from news sources, social media that is spreading harmful misinformation about trans folks and our lived experiences. And the real harms of that are that politicians are using this information to not only share it across media, but these articles, stories, and pieces are also being cited and quoted in legislation that ultimately becomes law in some states. Violence is at an all-time high against trans people. It should be of note that visibility is great. It has made our community more of a target, which corresponds with the violence that we are facing, both physical, spiritual. It's really hard right now for trans folks. And again, I kind of just alluded to this a couple of seconds ago. The trans disinformation has led to a spike in trans legislation all across this country, but particularly states in the Midwest and the Deep South, where you're seeing anti-trans legislation range from banning trans women and girls in sports at the K through 12 level, all the way to banning gender affirming care for trans youth, and in some states banning it or proposing to ban it for trans people across the board, including trans adults. So it's a lot of things happening in the US right now that is very triggering, that's very alarming, and it's really causing us to rise to action. So the current status of anti-trans and anti-drag laws this year, over 300 pieces of anti-trans legislation has been introduced. We've seen some of the harshest anti-trans, anti-drag laws be introduced in states like Tennessee, in states like Florida, also in Texas. It should be of note that a lot of these it's only been signed into law in Florida and in Tennessee, but it should be just to give us little nuggets of hope. There are a lot of legacy nonprofit social justice legal organizations that are organized and that are challenging these laws. So a lot of these laws, at least at the federal district court level, have been stopped. And while that gives us a little pause, a little sense of relief, the right is, this is part of the scheme of the right to ultimately create circuit splits to ultimately get these issues up to the Supreme Court. And we all know the composition of the Supreme Court is conservative leaning, and it's likely that if these issues go through the process and they get to the Supreme Court the way that it is constituted now, that it's highly likely that the Supreme Court will rule that these different states have it is within their right to regulate anti-trans and anti-drag laws at the state level, and there can be no federal relief. So it's a very complex time because it's a lot of these laws. We are pushing back. We're trying to stop these laws, but we know the ultimate end game is for the right to get these issues to the Supreme Court, so the Supreme Court can ultimately give the power back to the states so that they can continue to promulgate these laws with no interference. So where did these laws come from? These laws, again, like I alluded to before, these laws are a part of a coordinated and well-funded attack by religious conservatives to push back against the progress achieved not just trans folks, but marginalized people across this country. There's actually investigative journalistic podcast called the Anti-Trans Hate Machine that is produced by Translash Media, which was founded by Amara Jones, which I believe the podcast is currently in its second season, where she does a very deep and investigative dive into just how well-funded and well-coordinated the right was, and making sure to sow this disinformation, which ultimately led to these laws which came about. It should be of note that laws against trans people, laws against LGBTQ folks, it's the same tactic when we think about the anti-CRT movement and the movement to remove critical race theory from schools, and just the attacks against particularly Black folks, and attacks against race. A lot of the attacks against trans and LGBTQ folks come from the same playbook. And when you trace them, and when we're talking about well-funded, we're talking about organizations and think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, organizations like Alliance Defending Freedom. Even in some of the Supreme Court cases, the Alliance Defending Freedom, they have they're kind of like the opposite of the ACLU, where they have a litigation arm that bring these cases. When you think about the affirmative action case, Students for Fair Admission, a lot of these different organizations, they are being funded, and Moms for Liberty and all of that. They're being funded, they're well-resourced, they're well-organized to, and that's why their attacks seem like they're relentless. That's why they seem like when it's they go from state to state, from intersectional issue to intersectional issue. So it's important to really, I think how we are going to survive and how we're going to overcome is to really study and understand how their ecosystem works, so we can start to identify people, so we can be a part of dismantling it and really holding the people accountable that make that ecosystem run. Okay, so on a positive note, because there always has to be a positive note, and I'm happy to be a part of this. Locally, there are society and community responses to what is going on. And because this is a Black conversation, I'm going to be focusing on what Black trans leaders are doing across the country, and how we are responding, and also ultimately how we're keeping our joy and keeping our hope. I'm happy to say this, and I'm happy to be a part of this. Now in 2023, there are more, we have the most Black trans led nonprofits that we've ever had in this country, especially in the South and the Midwest. And we are pushing back against these laws and creating resilience for our community in a multitude of ways. Some of them include direct advocacy, holding demonstrations at state capitol, working in collaboration with other national organizations to spread information, to do demonstrations, and also just organizing our community on the ground. So for example, Lavender Rights Project is in partnership with two Black trans-led organizations in Houston, the Mahogany Project and Saving Our Sisters United. And we're working together to not only provide just support to another Black trans-led org in the South, but really for us to kind of strategize together how we can work across geographical boundaries to make sure that we're not only being a resource for our siblings in the South, but also making sure that we're able to amplify what their needs are directly from them. Because typically when you have the larger organizations, like for instance, like the ACLU or Lambda Legal, typically, it might be one plaintiff, but it's really hard to get a sentiment from the people on the ground that is impacted the most by what is going on. And our natural relationships are a way for us to kind of share resources, to kind of amplify what is going on, and also to kind of let Black trans folks that are most impacted kind of lead what they want their win to look like, or what they want, just what they want to look like so yeah, it's so important for us to partner together. Also, Black trans folks, Black trans-led organizations across the country, we are organizing and convening our trans leaders to see what are the real issues, and how can we work together to help each other during these times. One of my personal philosophies is, even though times are the worst that they are right now, Black trans folks have always existed. We've always created support systems for each other. Even though things are hard right now, we have everything that we need to support each other. So it's all about not being isolated from each other in these moments. It's all about establishing intentional and mutual methods of communication with each other and making sure that we amplify each other's needs. Also, we are providing mutual aid to benefit members who are directly impacted by these laws. For instance, in Houston, the Mahogany Project, which is an organization that LRP is partnered with, they have a drag fund where they're raising money, they're soliciting money to give back to drag queens that are impacted by these laws. Nobody else is doing this to put money back into the pockets of drag queens, and they tend to serve majority Black and brown drag queens who, when these laws are publicized and when there's just news coverage or media, it financially impacts these queens who, and if you ever been to the South, but particularly Houston, there's an industry of drag queen, and it's primarily trans folks that are working and have regular gigs. So it's also our organizations that are trying to figure out how to get money directly to our own community so that through the duration of this, we have the things that we need to survive and thrive. And also, in states like Washington, where Lavender Rights is located, and also there's another state, Maryland, which is my home state. There's another Black trans-led organization, Baltimore Safe Haven. Those states have been deemed safe havens. So also it's about, again, convening leaders from that have organizations and states that are a little bit more friendlier to trans folks, being in conversation with them, convening with them, and also seeing how we can support them, as we've seen there have been an influx of trans people who have fled to those states and come to get assistance from those organizations. And they also need help. They also need access to funds so they can get a larger infrastructure so that they can keep up with the need. So we as Black trans-led organizations and Black trans activists, we're trying to figure out how to rely on each other so that we can sustain ourselves through these uncertain times. So that's a little bit of what's going on in the States from a Black trans lens.
So next we have Ruth Muganzi from Uganda. Thank you, Bryanna.
Thank you so much, Bryanna, for that informative conversation. Thank you, Jamila. Hi, everyone. My name is Ruth Muganzi from Uganda. I work with an entity called Kuchi Times Media Group. Kuchi Times is a community media platform here in Uganda created by LGBTQIA Ugandans. We created this space after the passage of the last anti-gay bill, the 2014 anti-homosexuality bill, where we realized that much of the achievements that had been achieved by the anti-gay movement had been centered around creating the narrative that we were gay for money, recruiting children, or simply importing an African practice. And realize that as LGBTI Ugandans, it's upon us to ensure that our voices are there. Maybe if we put a face to the things that people have been told to fear. Everyday Ugandans will come to learn that we are their friends, we're their neighbors, they have nothing to fear about us. And maybe these anti-gay narratives that had been imported, like the example Bryanna gave, by religious fundamentalists from the West, could be challenged by the fact that people can see that we are Ugandan. Most of us have never interacted with a white person. There's no way we imported our existence. And that was in 2014. And we're seeing now we have a new law, a new act in Uganda, the Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2023, that has as well adopted the narrative, spreading this anti-gay rhetoric that spread the narrative that still we are recruiting children. I'll say that much of the time when we saw this anti-gay conversation come up in Uganda recently, it's within the last 6 months that we've seen the harshest implications of anti-gay narratives in mainstream. But we've had the conversation started earlier at the end of last year, where we saw reports of children being violated in Christian-founded schools here in Uganda. And instead of our media taking on the narrative of checking these sexual violent acts that were happening against children, much as they were, in some cases reported of male teachers violating boys in schools, in Christian schools that are rooted in Christian values, the conversation was switched around by our parliamentarians to say these are homosexual practices. Homosexuals are recruiting children. Homosexuals are taking on promotion. There's been promotion of homosexuality that has led to the recruitment of children. And that is part of the conversation that led to this new act that we have right now in Uganda that has provisions that go as far as punishing the act of identifying as an LGBTI person with life imprisonment, and in cases of aggravated homosexuality, the death sentence. But as LGBTI Ugandans, we've been organizing for the last 20 years. And I'll say this new act simply makes our organizing, brings another layer of difficulty to our organizing, much as it criminalizes the act of us organizing by calling it promotion of homosexuality. We are a resilient movement that has had to organize under very difficult conditions over the last 20 years. So we've seen the narrative, the conversations from before Uganda has been termed as one of the worst places to be gay. And we understand that on the African continent, the Ugandan movement has consistently been targeted by this imported homophobia under the clout of Uganda is the Pearl of Africa. But we see that once the bill comes to a country like Uganda and the attention that it's given, then it goes again to be duplicated in Kenya, it goes to Nigeria, it goes to Ghana. The same groups have been doing this work in Africa, starting with Uganda. And I'll say that much as we've seen in the last almost 60 days since the president signed on to this bill, violations against LGBTI people have radically increased. We're seeing more people being evicted from their homes. We're seeing more people being attacked on the streets. We're seeing more transgender identifying individuals being undressed on the streets and paraded by police agents. We're seeing landlords or home owners asking people to move out of their homes because they're also seeking to protect themselves, because among the provisions of this bill is a clause that encourages people or calls people to report suspected homosexual individuals or activities. This has meant that our safe spaces that we've created, like I said, we've been organizing for 20 years. In those 20 years as a movement, we've been able to create our safe spaces, social safe spaces. We have our own community-run clinics. We've been able to organize in different ways as LGBTI people. That was our way of creating the safety, because we understand that without the narratives, the media's intervention or interpretation of our identities, everyday normal Ugandans are dealing with the same difficulties that we are. We go to the broken down hospitals, we are living with the high rates of corruption. So local Ugandans weren't really interested in how we lived. But once the narrative came to say, we are recruiting children, we are being gay for money, we are the we are the people that are causing so many political problems, then the homophobia that we are currently facing, much of which is manifesting in these last almost 60 days, has been a bit of a stressful environment for us, but it's not something new. And as a movement, we've had to go back and restructure ourselves. The current interventions that are being put in place by the community in terms of responding to this anti-gay bill, we've put out 2 petitions already filed in court. These are led and are filed under the Convening for Equality, which is a collective led by LGBTI activists. What we're seeing with this is, after 20 years of organizing as LGBTI people, would love to be center in the interventions that come through at this point, because for us, we're fighting for our lives. Yes, we appreciate that the burden to our allies for standing with us, because even that act of standing with LGBTI people at this point has been criminalized. Even by Radcoms hosting this, if Uganda had a way, you would be punishable under law, because now you're creating space for LGBTI people to speak about our narratives. They have criminalized and seeking to isolate LGBTI people and then fully shut down our existence. But that is not something that as a people, we are going to just roll over and say, it's okay. Interventions are being put in place, guided by LGBTI people. We understand that what's at stake at this point, and we appreciate the allies that are standing with us. And I feel that spaces like this, where we're speaking about the commonalities that are existing in these challenges that we're facing, like Bryanna noted in her presentation, that much of this homophobia is rooted in this whole narrative of religion and values and family values international. When you look at the money that is moving these anti-gay conversations across different continents, more so within the African spaces, it's run by the same people who were behind the anti-gay bill that we had in 2014, went back to the drawing board, had their movements sustain this fight, which didn't happen, which us as the LGBT movement or allies of human rights did not have. The breakdown in the financing of our movements or the fight for human rights on the side of us as affected people broke down in the last 10 years, which is why now we are seeing that the implications, how the other side is structured to be able to bring to the flow of parliament a bill like this that has clauses that speak to the death penalty, and having it pass in a record time, having the president veto it, and then it comes back without any changes to it. The political powers behind that movement of this bill has a clear hand of religious fundamentalists that are coming from the West. And I believe that much as attention is being given to the implications of this bill, of these laws, these anti-gay laws, these anti-gender laws across the globe, attention must be given for us to understand the political influence that is within these criminalization of a minority group. We believe that as we structure ourselves, as the fact that LGBTI people are actively involved in the interventions that we're putting in place to ensure that the effects of this bill are not as adverse as we feared, we've made sure that there are different groups that are responding to the challenges that are coming up. We have different groups that are working on the legal front. We need to have different ways of fighting this law. We understand that. So we have legal committees that are working on the legal front. We have people working on in terms of curating the narrative and ensuring that we can track what is being said, what harmful statements and how those impact us. Of course, part of doing the media narrative is ensuring that those tools that are being used to spread this homophobia that we're seeing in Uganda. And I'll take it back to the statement Jamila raised earlier, the fact that much of why we're seeing a bigger impact or a wider spread violence against LGBTI people with this act that we didn't see in the years before is the tools of information spread have become diverse. The internet and the fact that we don't have control, or the people who created those tools or platforms refuse to come to the understanding with we activists or the people whose lives are being affected, and instead feed into the political powers to say we shall not censor talks on platforms like TikTok, where people have been actively recording videos in local language and calling for the breaking down of non-LGBTI people's houses, drag them on the street, kill them, beat them. Like those speeches on those platforms which as a collective trying to counter the implications of this law. Even when we write and keep requesting, they will not respond because they will say they cannot track the language. They do not have but when we saw in the last election, when the president didn't like the anti-political conversations that were going on platforms like Facebook, they were able to close down so many accounts because then they're speaking to the political powers. But when we are asking them consistently, like the narratives, the anti-gay narratives online are actively affecting our lives. We are actively losing our friends. We're actively being violated, and there's nothing they can do about that. This new working environment, the internet, the globalization of communication has made even us as activists, of course, we're grappling with how to engage at this point. But I'd love to say that while the the world has given us so much solidarity stand during these times as the Ugandan movement, and we don't take that lightly. And it says a lot to us that the world, we've created a movement of other people who believe in the fact that as LGBTI Ugandans, we have the right to be here. You cannot criminalize how we love. You cannot dictate how we receive or share information. You can say we shouldn't. You can tell us all, but we are not willing. For us as LGBTI people, this is a fight for our lives. And this means we're going to have to take on whatever tools, non-violent tools, but we shall consistently stand in our truth, reorganize, and keep fighting these anti-gay laws that keep coming to Uganda. And in some way, I believe that also the progress that we're looking towards, the more they give us acts to fight, reasons to fight, the better structured we become as a movement. How resilient or how we sustain that fight is another conversation, but I would say that for us as people on ground, as LGBTI people on ground, our spirits are not broken. We want to ensure that people know that LGBTI people are African. We have been here, we're not an import of the West. The religious factor, or that when groups come in and say that you're passing these bills to protect threats against heterosexual relationships or heterosexual family structures. I, as a lesbian woman living in Kampala, I'm more at risk of my heterosexual neighbor who lives next door, because the minute he understands that I'm a lesbian woman living here, and now that we have these laws that legalize his responses, let's say he doesn't really appreciate my life, he has been given the leeway to act out, to come at me with violence, and there's nothing I can do about it under this law. But while the law says that, we're refusing to have our voices taken away from us. We shall continue to organize, we shall continue to speak, and we shall keep fighting back until it becomes criminal for a person to stand in a house, in parliament of all places, and say a certain group of people should be erased simply because they love different, or simply because our politicians refuse to interpret what the social problems are at that point, which when we saw the beginning of this law was sexual violence against children in these Christian-founded schools, who are positioning themselves as the moral police and judges of value. So I think, sorry, Jamila, I could have gone ahead of my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Everything you said was so touching and incredible. So now we have Tihi to talk to us about what's happening in Mexico.
Yeah, hello everyone. Happy to be here. Great to share this space with Ruth and Bryanna. I'm gonna go very, very fast. And also full disclosure, I'm a US citizen. I live in Mexico, so I'm an immigrant. And that affects a lot of the LGBT activism that I'm allowed to do in Mexico. But Mexico is an interesting place. There's a very, like a lot of things in Mexico, it's a duality. So there's like two competing kind of things. So we have a lot of laws on our side when it comes to LGBT rights in Mexico. How much do these laws get enforced? So there's like anti-discrimination in employment and housing. We've had that since 2003. That's great. We have several places in Mexico that are like informally known as safe havens. I live in one of them, Puerto Vallarta, in Jalisco. We're not the statistical majority, but we definitely look like it when you land and walk around our city. It's very, very queer, and it's very forward. At the same time, Mexico is a Catholic country, and it is mostly a socially conservative country. But just like in the United States, membership within the church is declining. That doesn't mean that the church doesn't exert influence. They still have some influence, but even that is also declining. It's a little bit like which weighs heavier, capitalism or Catholicism, and it's like capitalism tends to win out. Next slide, please. So Mexico is actually growing and evolving and changing. This is kind of like a bright, happy thing. Like tolerance and acceptance of LGBT people in Mexico is definitely increasing. Mexico City has one of the largest pride celebrations on the planet. And it's a huge economic driver for the city. So thusly, the city government and the national government heavily invest in it. They see, like I said, capitalism. Everybody chases the dollar in Mexico, and they've learned that the gay community, the LGBT community, can bring dollars. The same thing is true in Puerto Vallarta. It's a huge LGBT vacation destination, which means that like the culture there is very different than, say, if you lived in rural parts of Mexico that are more conservative. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight this commercial because it's very interesting. It's a Halloween commercial for Dia de los Muertos that the Doritos company put out as a national ad buy last year. Let's see if we can play it. I don't want to give too much of a spoiler alerts. Is there sound?
Hermano, coño.
Sorpresa. Yo, familia, ¿cómo están? ¿Quién es él? Es Mario, mi pareja.
Creí que este iba a estar solo para siempre.
Okay, yeah. So that's like a really interesting thing to see, considering that this summer in the United States, when like, Budweiser, did some promotions with like trans influencers, the company almost folded, right? The backlash was so strong. But here in Mexico, Dia de los Muertos is such a huge part of the culture. And for them to insert like LGBT acceptance in there was kind of huge. And it invited like no major backlash. So while this might seem like it's a gay paradise, is it really? The answer, no, it's not. One of the big things that I think is sort of like the forefront of LGBT activism in Mexico right now is around ideas of housing and gentrification and displacement. Lots of people from the US, Canada, and Europe are like, oh my gosh, it's so much more comfortable for me. And when I say lots, I mean mostly like white and white passing wealthy men. They can live so much more comfortably in Mexico. So they're moving here in droves and they're displacing people, not just like the local straight and cisgendered residents of Mexico, but even the local LGBT people in Mexico who really rely on safe haven cities like Puerto Vallarta or Mexico City. If they don't have the family support, they need to go somewhere to thrive, but they're being priced out increasingly. It's getting very, very crazy. Next slide. I think that's actually my last slide. Yep, cool.
Amazing. Thank you all. I really want to highlight before we get into the questions, I'm actually going to speed this up because it's later in the discussion, some of the overarching narratives that we're seeing from these three very different countries. And I also want to invite folks to use the Q&A, use the hand raised feature as well, because we want you to be able to ask questions to the panel. So before we get started on this first question, I really want to highlight what we're seeing from the opposition, these narratives of queer and trans folks are grooming children, seeing the rise of religion being used to discriminate against queer and trans folks, even when we all know when we look at sexual violence, particularly against minors, we look at Christian institutions in particular, also the Catholic Church, we've seen the amounts of violence that have come, but as a way to kind of hide their sins, they tend to place the blame on queer and trans folks. We've seen that really since the dawn of time. The money that is coming through from these organizations, from evangelicals, from foundations like the Heritage Foundation. And I think it's critically important to understand what Bryanna really clearly outlined in terms of the funding also has the same implications in Uganda. And we see that around the world. And Ruth really drove it home by saying that the anti-homosexuality bill that is passed this year in Uganda will be replicated We're seeing like parity bills coming up across the African continent, in Kenya, in Ghana, pardon, I'm like speaking Spanish because I'm talking about Mexico, excuse me. But we're seeing that pop up around the continent, but these are also things that happen around the world. Now, as a kind of antidote to that, the counter narratives that are just genuinely and authentically coming up from our community are resilience. 20 years, folks in Uganda have been doing this. We know folks in the United States, like the queer liberation movement began around the 1960s, right? For decades, people have been organizing in Mexico and throughout Latin America. We're looking at joy, like that joy, that love, holding on to that in the midst of extreme devastation. I'm really inspired by Ruth saying that our spirits are not broken, from activists in Uganda. Is really heartening to hear. And also centering queer and trans voices. Like, what is the through line between each of these places is that you have queer and trans folks who are at the center of creating the solutions to the problems. So the more that we have Black trans-led organizations, the fact that there are more than we've ever had before is incredible. The fact that now in Uganda, the violence and the discrimination is actually created more infrastructure amongst the community, and the responses are actually coming from queer and trans folks to be able to create that legislation is incredible. And we're creating our own funding sources through mutual aid and other projects to help folks, and we see that happening across. So grounding that conversation, I'll ask the question, how are you all seeing and also advancing the narrative of inclusivity in your country? What are the stories you're telling in order to create this world that is radically inclusive for queer and trans folks? So I'll ask Tihi first. I'll move backwards, and keep your responses short if you can.
How are we advancing the narrative of inclusivity and queer and trans liberation in our country? I think that, like, yeah, there's this interesting, the narrative I see that's happening a lot in Mexico is like a dual one. There's a dual tension there. So one of it is like completely naturalized and integrated. Queer people are a part of your family, just like we saw with that Doritos commercial. That is like a long, long ancient Mexican tradition that they were like, whoa, but you know, our families are sometimes queer and include queer people. And that's great. But there's also this narrative, if you come from more rural parts of Mexico and you're queer, it's get out. You need to go to Puerto Vallarta to be safe. You need to go to Mexico City to be safe. And then it's not easy to actually, you know, get a living, make a living, find housing there. So I think that, like, what we would like, or what I try to do in advancing the narrative is like inclusivity includes housing, and that some people, you know, like some people have a little bit more of a right to housing, like the people who are born and raised in this country, Mexico, should get some housing over rich white people who want to be more comfortable, you know, and like maybe sometimes calling people in and calling people out of like, don't rent that apartment just because it's cheap. It's also cheap for a local, and they deserve to be here too. They're a part of our LGBT community also. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ruth, what about the work you're doing in Uganda and your colleagues?
I'll say that for us here, we understand that for us to address the social discrimination aspects, we need to allow our communities to be able to see us. Let them hear our voices. Let's normalize, do the work of allowing even our friends, our families to come out with us. It's not the forceful acts of resistance to say, I'm queer and I'm here, you have to take me. Or for us to be able to create community, we're allowing ourselves as LGBTI people to come out, own our voices, tell our stories, not just stories of how hectic or terrible to live in Uganda, but also stories of success, because we have amazing LGBTI people involved in different aspects, contributing in different aspects to this society. Our clinics don't only serve LGBTI people. Then Ugandans who are disadvantaged, whose only access to quality healthcare is through the free services that we provide in our safe spaces. We also understand that for us to be able to address the issue of political exclusion or discrimination and homophobia that we face, we have to take the risk of fighting on the legislation front. That is still a battle that we are actively engaged in as LGBTI people. And I think those two fronts are much of where our work is rooted, ensuring that we are active in our societies. Our friends, we're coming out to our friends and families and allowing them to have the difficult conversations with us. Because within the African culture, when the anti-gay movement over-sexualized the conversation of LGBTI people, it closed down what it means for people to accept us. But now when we speak on our realities, stepping away from the sexual aspects or the diseased community, conversation is opening up. We're opening those spaces for inclusion, and yeah, we're positive about this journey.
Thank you. Bryanna, what about your work?
I think what I'm doing and part of the work that I'm trying to create is I just operate from the motto that nobody is going to save us, particularly as a Black and trans person, and that Black trans people have the tools. We have always had the tools and everything within us to save ourselves, to lead our own movement. So I think at this part of my life and how I see the movement now, I'm all about building up Black trans folks in the movement so that we can be here for the long haul. So that means mentoring, working at a Black trans-led organization, serving on boards of other Black trans-led organizations, doing development for Black trans staff. Because of racism and how it operates here in America, particularly in the nonprofit arena, Black LGBT folks, period, but especially Black trans folks, we are pitted against each other. We are tokenized. We are exploited. And typically what happens is that white queer folks get everything that they need, while Black queer folks, we are isolated from our communities, we're turned against each other, we're pitted against each other, and then we have nothing to show for it. So at this point, I'm all about doing what we can to bring us together regionally, nationally, wherever. We all need to have access to the same information, and also building up our skills and capacities so that we, not only that we liberate each other, but we know that we have the tools and we have the talent to liberate each other through these times.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I will also highlight that it is not an accident that this panel appears the way that it does, because we do have to confront racism even within queer and trans communities, and recognizing that white folks still benefit from white privilege, and we don't hear enough from the voices of Black folks, from mixed folks, from folks of color in these conversations. So thank you all for that. I know our time is running short, so I am very curious to take a moment to take questions from the audience. Is there, looking at the chat. All right, so I'm going to take a question from Tori. So Ruth and Bryanna clearly spoke about financing and how it's not consistent, especially in contrast to the well-funded right. How do we work to rectify that?
I'll speak from like my I guess American perspective, working with nonprofits is really moving. One of the things that we're trying to do, and we're trying to figure out the best way to do it, is moving funders to moving them to more unrestricted funding and moving them to more long-term and sustainable funding. These are issues that they're just not going to be around while it's a soundbite on the news, or like these are things that it's going to take us years and decades to really strategize and really organize the way that we need to in order to address this like over our lifetimes. So it's kind of learning how, trying to figure out how to walk that dance, because the reality is funding can be scarce and funding can end. So it's really trying to be direct with funders and different funding opportunities that we go out for. Hey, we need this money, and also we know what we're doing, and just trying to have that conversation to with funders and different to really give us the money, give up the money so that we can do this work, and so that we can plan, and that we're not operating from a place of scarcity. I don't think it's a right answer. I don't think it's a wrong answer. I think it's a complex thing, but I think we have to really have the conversation about how like capitalism and performative activism, how it really hurts us here on the quote unquote left, and how people want to appear to do the right thing, but then when the cameras go away, the money is drying up. And I can say that just across the board, like charitable funding across all social justice orgs is down, and we're not even 5 years out of the racial reckoning of 2020 and everything that came from that. And we really have to ask a hard question: why is the money going away on our side? Meanwhile, on the conservative evangelical side, they're consistently able to get large sums of money to do large scale work. Why is that?
Yeah, thank you for that. I actually have quite a lot of thoughts on this. And one of the things that I will encourage folks to do, if you consider yourself to be an ally in particular, you need to give your money away. Regranting is the number one thing that you can do. Like, we already know that white Western organizations are going to get those dollars. You have the resources, you have the intel, you have the connections, you have all of that. Giving your money, regranting it without conditions to queer and trans folks, particularly queer and trans folks of color, is exactly what you can do. And Bryanna is 100% correct in that we don't often step up or move up to do the right thing when the cameras are not on, and that is the easiest thing that you can do. And philanthropic intermediaries were created specifically to do kind of more of this focus work for communities that have historically been marginalized, and they are helpful. But you as an organization, if you have the ability to, can actually give your money directly to folks who need it. I'm gonna do another time check with Ariana. How am I doing? How much more time can we have?
Yeah, it looks like our panelists can stay on for about 10 minutes, so we can hopefully take a couple of questions, either the panel discussion questions or questions from the chat. I'm also going to drop, I want to make sure people are listening to the questions. I'm going to drop our feedback survey in the chat to the group. This is really helpful for us as we develop programming. So if you have 2 minutes, please let us know your thoughts, and hand it back to our host and panelists.
Okay, great. Well, I'll mix it up and ask another question. Let's see. How are you as a change maker currently navigating the criminalization of homophobia and transphobia, or in Tihi's example, I think, like, how has it been combated? How have you overcome it?
I just put a starburst in my mouth. Sorry, I'm eating all this Netroots conference food. There is, like, even though Port of Arthur seems like a safe place, there is also, we often get a lot of acts of violence against our LGBT community, our queer brothers and sisters. It's a little difficult for me personally. I support movements with money. I support them with time. As an immigrant, I can't publicly be a part of political demonstrations, or else I can get deported. So I have to do a lot of things like behind the scenes. Most recently, after our Pride Parade in Puerto Vallarta, a young Mexican citizen who is deaf and queer went missing. So we spent weeks putting up flyers, I put up flyers. I couldn't do the demonstrations in front of the police department. The police department was not going to look into this. But there was a lot of public pressure on this. And eventually we were able to find his body in a shallow grave about 2 weeks later. Now the step up is to actually get the police to investigate this as a murder. They found a body and they closed the case, and they don't want to look into it further. So that's some of the stuff that we're doing. And because I can't be on the front lines, I always find the way to be like on the support side. And so like whether that's like financial support, whether that's like donating my like expertise of my mind as like an activist with a long history of civil disobedience in the United States to help train other folks locally and like help them go over tactics and things like that. The ways in which I can do it that is safe and that doesn't affect my immigration status.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that speaks to kind of some of the questions about what people can do. So just being able to think creatively of how to participate is really, really important. I am looking for another question. This one is from Michelle. So I know we talk a lot about legislation, but I wonder how other indicators are being tracked and communicated. For instance, in Maine, if you look at the SPLC hate group concentration, you can see the depth of hate. We have the highest numbers of deaths by cops per capita in many towns. We vote directly up or down for school budgets, which turned into book ban votes. So we could not bring forward issues of decarceration and funding policy. Maine is the whitest state in the US with a large tourist economy, very poor rural counties, including many indigenous people. And our governor marked us as a sanctuary state. So the question here is really about tracking. I think that this is one of the things I think, quite honestly, is a movement for folks who are radical communicators like ourselves, that we have a lot of areas to grow in. To be quite honest, like it's very easy to track the legislation because we're able to kind of see that. When I'm an alum of working with the Opportunity Agenda, one of the things we would do is actually do social media scans to get a real understanding of the attitudes and sentiments, like as things were starting to become kind of more nationally focused around especially like mass incarceration issues, around poverty, around housing, as those things were bubbling up. We began to track those trends. And I will say personally, I think that as a movement, we are always on the reactive and on the defensive, and we're often not on the offensive. So your question really calls upon us to do that kind of testing and tracking. But this is actually one of the reasons we wanted to do this panel, was to really focus on how do we seed the narratives that, and I'll actually get ready to close with this, seed the narratives around how queer people have always existed. That's it. We know queer and trans folks have always been here, have always been around. As Ruth and Bryanna talked about so beautifully, not only have queer and trans folks always existed, but have always been the solutions for the problems, and have always been able to, take care of our siblings, our communities, etc. And I think that is extremely important for us, is to, like, how do we do the work to also get the funding, get the infrastructure, confront the nonprofit industrial complex, confront even racism and homophobia and transphobia within our own movements to do the work, and also make sure that we're re-educating the public. So when you're doing narrative work, it's really about replacing those dominant narratives with counter narratives. And our counter narratives are grounded in truth. So we know it's like it's like Quinta Brunson, I think everybody's favorite meme, right? People be gay, people be gay. It is always existed from the dawn of time, right? So how do we get those messages out? How do we it's shocking to see a commercial like that come from Doritos of all places, but it is a beautiful, beautiful representation. And to be able to tie it so deeply to culture as well, I think that really is the kinds of impacts that we're hoping to make. And another thing I'll also lift up is in Uganda. So since I've been, working with folks there like Ruth, and I actually started doing my organizing work as a digital campaigner in 2014 against the first wave of this legislation. It was the first digital campaign that I ran internationally. But one of the things that I've learned is that there were former kings of Uganda who were queer. And, those are the histories that we bury. Like, we have actively buried and suppressed queer and trans history. throughout time. So it's truly that reclamation. And the more that we're able to construct those stories and to push that out there, but not just us pushing it, but really going along with the movement, moving alongside folks who are already living the experience, doing the work, that is the most important. So I want to wrap it up and thank you all for being here. Please make sure to fill out the feedback survey. That would be incredible. As you can see, we have so much to talk about, and our panelists are such experts that we wanted to give them some space and some time. We can continue this conversation. Some of the things that we've been talking about collectively is how we move this forward. So feel free, I'm on the RadComs list. I will be emailing folks who want to continue to be in conversation around how we build and construct these narratives that are extremely inclusive, how we do this together. Also, please make sure that you fill out the survey. That way you can get in touch and do some assistance with the organization. So you've heard the Lavender Project. You've heard the publication that Ruth works for. There are so many different ways for you to donate your time, your money, your resources, all of that. So please feel free to do that. Tihi is an incredible activist, but also an incredible author and has written some amazing books. So please, that are focused on queer and trans folks and doing that world building actually that we talk about. So there are many ways to get in touch with folks. I am a consultant working in service to the movement as much as possible. But thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for spending your Fridays, your summer Fridays for many of you. And yes, thank you again and have a wonderful rest of your day.